Welcome back. When we do a study, we collect data from various groups of people or from a set of people. This might be anywhere from a small sample, maybe 20 to 30 people, might have hundreds of thousands of people in a study, or really anywhere in between. Now, over the past 5 lectures, we have talked about different ways of describing data. When I sit down to start analyzing data, often I'll actually spend quite a bit of time just getting to know what's there, describing the variables I have, describing who's in my sample, really dating my data as I mentioned previously. For categorical variables, I'll calculate frequencies and I'll consider things like the modal response. I might even create a bar chart, and so I can actually illustrate the distribution in each of the categories. For continuous variables, I tend to calculate the mean and the median, as we did a few times ago, to indicate the center of the data. I tend to calculate the minimum and the maximum and the standard deviation to indicate the spread of the data. And then sometimes I'll do some other measures of central tendency and variance or spread as well, as we've talked about over the past few lectures. I'll also create histograms. Again, that visual representation is a really nice way to get to know the variables, how people are responding to things, and they give me a visual sense of the sample. And between the visualizations and things like the minimum and the maximum, it also helps me check my data so I can make sure that there are no data entry errors, that the values actually make sense. And so all of this is getting to know the data that I have, checking for errors, and really getting a good sense of it before moving on and doing any other types of analyses. Now, when I do analyses like this, I find it's really helpful to be as organized as possible. When you start doing some analyses, you'll think you'll remember things, but when a week down the road or so, it gets really hard to remember things. One way I like to do that is using something like an Excel spreadsheet. So for instance, here's part of a spreadsheet. This first sheet here holds just the data itself, so I can keep track of it, what I have there. The second tab, I might put all of my analyses there to summarize everything that I've done and really keep track on things. So for example, here's what I have on a sheet. I can summarize things like the frequencies of different variables. And then I also have my descriptive table here with things like the number of people, the mean, the standard deviation, the minimum, and the maximum. Now, summarizing things in a spreadsheet like this does a couple things. First of all, it helps me summarize things, keep track, and remember what I've done. In a program like Excel, we can actually calculate a lot of this automatically, things like the mean, the minimum, the maximum. And we can also do some simple graphs and charts as well. And I'll show you how to do some of that at another time. It's a really useful way of having some of your analyses and visualizations right there. The other thing is like with this descriptive table here, I can actually set it up in a way that I could actually take this table, copy and paste it into a Word document as part of a manuscript that I'm going to submit for publication. And so I organize things in my Excel document, and then I can work very easily with my Word document as I put together a publication. So as a data analyst, I use various descriptive statistics at the very beginning to get a good sense of who's in my sample, how they responded on different measures. That's an important part about my understanding. Now, beyond my personal knowledge, we also want to convey that information to other people. Most studies that you read often have 2 descriptive sections. Not always, but when you read through them, you might see this. First, oftentimes we'll see a description of the sample. For example, here's the description of actually 2 samples that were part of a study I did on law students at 2 universities and their character strengths. What we see here is I indicate the number of people, how many females and males, and I also give some descriptive statistics here. So in the text, it's a way of summarizing who's there. And as you read this, you can get a sense, okay, who was in that sample? How representative was it? Who is the population of interest? How did they typically score on things? Now, I might only present this in the text like this. Other times, I might actually create a table to summarize some of the information. Here's one, for example, giving the frequency across different categorical variables. And so some age categories, gender, education, giving the frequency and then the percent of the total that you have as well. I like tables a lot. It's a really nice way of summarizing information, and it's very easy to read format as opposed to trying to sort through lots of numbers in the text. Now, the other place that we tend to see descriptives is often in the first part of the results section. Good papers tend to start with this, giving you a bit of a description about how people responded on the measures before doing other analyses with them. So for instance, this is part of a paper I published earlier this year looking at mothers with multiple sclerosis. And so we were looking at a sense of psychological well-being and how they can have a sense of well-being despite dealing with this disability. So you see the very first part of the results section, I start by pointing to my descriptives. And I say, okay, look at them in the table. Now this looks a lot like the table that I had in Excel, and so it's giving the number, the mean, the standard deviation, the minimum, and the maximum. Sometimes we'll include things like the median, sometimes not. So this is sort of the core information I'll typically include in a descriptive table and what you'll typically see as you're reading through studies. Now in the text itself, I give sort of the narrative of that. So I'm keeping the numbers to the minimum while I'm conveying some of the key information a person might want to look at in the table itself. Now, oftentimes authors don't do that. Have you ever looked at a study in the results section and all you see is numbers? It's enough to put anyone to sleep. So tables are a really nice way of summarizing the numeric information while keeping the text to actually telling the narrative of the numbers. I also sometimes will see people will have a table and then they also put all the numbers in the text, which kind of defeats the purpose of the table. The whole point is to enhance readability and understanding of things. And so the text and the table should support each other but not be overly repetitious. Again, authors in the literature are really bad at this, so don't necessarily use them as examples. And also note, we'll often do a lot of descriptives when we're analyzing the data in our spreadsheet, but that doesn't necessarily mean we include all of this in our results or our methods section. And so in our writing, we want to include what's most relevant and is important for that particular study, not necessarily all of the analyses that I run as I do things. So this is a relatively brief session that brings things together about what we've talked about in terms of descriptive statistics. I really think descriptive statistics are a great way to understand who is my sample and how people responded on the different measures that are there. I can share some of that descriptive information in a paper, helping the reader to understand who the sample is and how they responded. And I can use things like spreadsheets as a way of organizing my calculations and the information as a whole. So hopefully this gives you a greater understanding both of what you see in articles and what you might want to include in your own studies. Thanks for listening. See you next time.